as a leader, I know you're supposed to model other leaders, right? And so I try to model all my leadership off of celebrities. So I'd like to talk about
Oh, wow.
some leaders, some celebrity leaders, like Pete Buttigeg.
Okay.
It's Pete. He's a transportation secretary. He's gotten himself repeatedly into some trouble over his tenure for being absentee. We kind of talked about that, being on vacation a lot or away from the office. At least that's the perception.
Yeah.
And then there was this whole tragedy in Ohio with the train wreck and the toxic gases and the fires. And a reporter, from a more conservative outlet went up to him and tried to interview him on the street. He was very, definitely rude and tried to cut her off and said, this is my space. Go back and look at what I've already said in the press room. Yeah. And then at the end of the sequence, takes out his cell phone and puts it up to her and starts taking her picture for whatever reason, maybe to get her blocked from other press events or something like that. Who knows? But the optics of it weren't good for him.
Yeah.
So was that a toxic behavior coming out? Were you getting to see something underneath Pete's veneer?
So this is so interesting. Because I think, so we were just talking about quiet quitting, right? And so the thoughts I have about when we think about people who are in the public sphere, and that can apply to political figures, celebrities, as you're talking about. I often think about the fact that we have now become a society that feels that we have the right to have access to people 24/7, regardless of who they are. And because I saw the clip of what you're talking about, and my first thought is I felt like he was trying to be respectful and say, look, I've given 12 interviews today. Can you please go look at that? Like, I'm just trying to have a walk. And I was like, well, if he's given 12 interviews, he's been on, dude's been on guard for a hot second. And my guess is not only this, but if you've been paying attention to anything, he is not having a good work life right now. With all the airplane problems and the near misses on, I can only imagine he's not living the best life. So my first thought is as much as I appreciate our free press and want people wanting to get access, I often also thought people are just people, and at a certain point they're going to crack. The veneer is going to crack. Yeah. So I have these two things. One, he's not a widget, and I think he cracked. Clearly, he cracked. And then I also think, though, is when you're in those positions, that people are going to come after you that way. And so how do you create a structure around yourself to prepare for the inevitable gotcha moments that happen in the world we live in now? Because immediately, when I was looking at that, I was like, that became one of the most clickable things that was out there everywhere. They weren't even talking about the fire anymore in Ohio. They were talking about that interaction. And so I found that interesting that what she was trying to question him about, nobody was even talking about that. They were talking about their interaction. And so, does that make him a toxic person? No. But what I would say is, I think what I would encourage is when you get to that stature, you have to create a structure around you, being aware that that's part of your reality now. It's no different than
because you've signed up for it in a sense, right? If you're going into that position and you're
going to be watched.
Considered a contender for the presidency at some point, that you're going to be under extra levels of scrutiny and people are going to make judgments about how you behave.
And ironically enough, with the fact that he's cruising around a town that is being inundated by toxic fumes, and what you just described seems to fit very easily and perfectly in your chapter. What's that smell? Right. This is a person that you're suggesting that is overworked, underappreciated, and let's be honest, kind of failing at his job right now, and is being scrutinized over it, rightly or not rightly. And so if we take a moment and think about, well, this is also a human, you can kind of explain away why this person, like you were saying, is behaving.
You can see where people snap. And And it's unfortunate because that's the last thing you want to happen, right? Because I talk about that in there. Like, you can have the best intentions for things, but but if you're burnt out and you're not thinking very clearly, you're going to burn it all down around you, and because you're going to execute it in the worst way possible. And that's kind of what I feel like I was seeing there, is like, there's a lot of ways he could have handled it differently. And I'm sure he probably thinks back on it and was like, I wish I would have handled that differently. But it's how do you put the guardrails around you to say, okay, I probably shouldn't have taken a walk outside if I really didn't want to be bombarded by paparazzi or news organizations or whatever. They're waiting for you out there. Like, unfortunately, your life has to be a little bit different when you hit a certain stature. I hope I never hit that stature, but I don't aim. My goals in life are not that high.
After this podcast,
everything's changing.
It's going to be an unbelievable change to your life. Let me tell you.
That's because Dan doxed everybody.
Yes, I do. I dox everybody. I think, to your point, you have to be media savvy. And I think the most media savvy leader that I try to emulate is Donald Trump. Right now, would you think that would you describe Donald as the Donald as a toxic leader?
What I would say, I think he is a perfect example of how some people view a leader as, like, you have some people, when you say his name, think he is like literally like a religious figure. Like, he is like a saint in some way. And then you can talk to other people who view him as absolute Satan. Yeah. Right. What I would say is he is probably no different than anybody else, is that he is somewhere in the middle. All I know is what I see of him on television and what I read. And so, again, I'm very cautious about saying what I think about that from a toxicity standpoint. I've never worked for him. I've never been in a room with him. But you hear different, you can hear such starkly different narratives depending on who's pushing what viewpoint. I would definitely say, I would encourage him at times to maybe think about his words more, because, I don't always understand what he's trying to communicate. But then people can say the same thing about Joe Biden. Yeah. So,
what was his tweet about confetti? Remember that?
Confetti.
I think he was really trying to say COVID, like a year before it happened.
Who knows? And I don't think we ever will.
He just misspelled it.
But again, the same thing being, for people who think can't do anything wrong, or, he's probably somewhere in the middle. And it's, how do we view people more as people and not as an
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I agree with you that the narratives of the hyper bipolar nature of our media, which is just off the charts, makes it impossible at times to kind of gauge the reality based upon those narratives. But I do feel like watching that gentleman, that he does send off signals to me that suggest he creates a toxic environment with the people around him. He does resemble to me a character from chapter 6. I mean, or is it? Right. Hasn't he said I'm God? I mean, hasn't he said I'm the greatest? I mean, so he literally has said those words. So
he is the greatest.
Only LeBron James should say that, right? So it's like I think, or Serena Williams. I feel that. I'll tell you what's toxic is talking about him. That becomes toxic for a lot of people so quickly, and it makes it tough. So you have to kind of watch yourself a little bit, because you don't want to be disrespectful to anybody, because he's just so polarizing.
Oh, I hope people actually watch the podcast long enough to get to this section.
This is the ending of our podcast. This is the last episode.
Okay, let's be very clear. I do not want pitchforks outside my house. So no. I mean, he definitely has a very healthy ego.
Sure.
And I think
healthy.
Yeah, I think
it's overweight.
it's a very healthy ego. And anybody who feels they are the best at everything, that can be a challenging
I
environment
would think
with
so,
which to
right? Just
operate.
that
I think
alone,
that's
right?
an
Yes,
accurate
exactly. Just that alone.
statement.
And you even kind of
Yes.
highlight the notion of then having to work in that shadow, right? Which becomes, by definition, kind of possibly a toxic environment. I can suggest other things,
Right.
I think, that are indicative that he would be someone I would never want to work for. But I think just that alone, just one of those things, right? You just, or a person who on their presidential run also is selling their steaks. I think there's something there. So I just think, regardless of the media polarization, yeah, I feel his behavior suggests certain things about it. But anyways, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it comes down to this. Yes, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but he's still around. So if he were literally as toxic as we're saying he is, why does he have sticking power? And why does he keep showing up? And why do people keep wanting to work with him? They keep wanting to be around him. So there has to be something there that we haven't.
Well, people wanted to work with
out
Steve
yet.
Jobs too, right? I mean, there's a difference between being toxic and I think you can be toxically effective, right? Like in the end, if the almighty dollar is what counts, and you're being Jack Welch, right? He's famous for being slashing GE, what they call him, Napalm Welch or something, like, because he just, and today his the way he approached things, we would say, was just evil, right? But at the time we qualified that because he was effective. He was getting the numbers for the SEC, for the stock market. That was for the metric that they cared about. Office happiness was not one of the metrics. Right? It's not, you don't see the stock market go up because everybody's really happy in the office. We're really, that's not the metric, right? It's dollars.
Yeah.
They weren't doing climate surveys back then?
Know. Yeah. So
we just weren't probably talking about them as much.
So I want to talk about another person who liked to sell food before they became president. Jimmy Carter. He sold peanuts, right? He was a peanut farmer.
Yep.
So what was he toxic? Do you think that there was a potential that Jimmy could have been toxic?
I think everybody has the
he's
potential.
Still alive.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, let's.
While we're recording, that is.
Yeah, I was like, man's on his deathbed. So, I mean, I think every person has the ability to be toxic. I don't think anybody is immune from it in any way, shape, or form.
He's such a nice, gentle man.
No, but I mean, just again, like I think everybody has the tendencies. Everybody has blind spots of some kind that can make them, difficult to be around or difficult to want to work for. So it just comes down to, I don't know enough about his leadership to be able to answer that particular question. I mean, I know a little bit about him, but I don't know enough about him.
Well, besides the sinful thoughts that somehow Dan is aware of,
but then again, he was like, the fact that he even admitted to that, like he brought in vulnerability before it was a thing.
Yes.
Yeah. He should have waited. He was as a man before his time. He would have been great as Gen Z president.
Well, think about it. He was the first to put solar panels in the White House.
That's right.
That's true.
That's right. Mm-hmm. But he was also he lost his election, people say, due to his malaise speech that basically was too truthful for the country. So one can argue that maybe one can be too vulnerable, and maybe too much vulnerability can be toxic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, have you ever worked with somebody who was the oversharer and you knew way too much about them? And then I
work with Jodah.
But I mean, you can have that. That's a very real thing. We're oh God, I know so much about their personal lives. I don't know why. It's not really. I'm grateful they feel safe sharing with me. But then again, now I feel strange. I know way too much about their home life. To the point you can't get things done. You can't. You're okay. Well, wow. Well, thanks for sharing.
Look at you now in a whole different light, right?
And next time I need help, I think I might call somebody else.
Yeah. You're always every time I come to you, you're crying. Yeah, this is not working for me.
Yeah.
The person who has a perpetual crisis.
There are those. You're right. Those are the people. Yes, and they tend to love to hang around HR and kind of get things done that way. It seems to me sometimes. But yeah.
HR loves them. HR loves those people.
They have them on speed dial.
Yeah.
It's even better when they are in HR.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh God, that's scary.